northern Italy, up in northern Italy, near the Dolomite Mountains. And it's close to the Po River too. My dad came over in 1928, and my mother and my brother and I came over in November of 1929. We lived in the south end of Hartford for quite a few years. My dad was a pastry chef. I was educated here. I went to St. Peter's School in Hartford, and then I graduated from Buckley High School. And right after high school, I enlisted in the Navy.
Oh.
That was in 1943. I was just 18.
18 years old?
Yeah.
And that actually answers my next question, which was, were you drafted or enlisted?
I enlisted.
Do you mind if I ask why that you enlisted?
Well, I found out I was going to be drafted. And rather than go into the Army, I always liked the sea, the ocean. I thought I would enlist in the Navy, and I did. So they took me in right away.
Wow.
I graduated high school in June of '43. And I went in September of '43. I went right into the
Right
Navy. They said they would call me when they were ready to accept me. And I wasn't a citizen at the time. And I had quite an experience. One afternoon I got home from school, and there were two men waiting for me in the hallway. We lived in a 4-family apartment house, and one of them flashed a badge at me and said FBI on it. So I said, you know, what's going on? And he said, nothing. He says, we got a couple of questions to ask you. He says, would you object to going into the service because you're not a citizen? And I said, not in the least. I says, I plan to enlist in the U.S. Navy as soon as I get out of school. And they said, fine. That's all we wanted to know. So as they were leaving, I says, do you mind if I ask you a question? You know? And he said, no. And I says, what happens if I refuse the service, you know, to go into any branch of the service? And he said to me, no, he says, we'll just ship your ass back to Italy. So I said, no, I'm ready to enlist. Anytime you people want me, I'm ready to go in, you know. So they said, you'll probably go in September of this year. So I said, fine.
And then you did? Had other family members of yours been involved in any wars or anything like that?
No, my dad was in the Italian Army, and when he was ready to get shipped to the front, the war was over. He was very fortunate. So, yeah.
And you said that you were 18 years old of entering the Navy? You were 18 years old?
Yeah, when I went in, yeah.
Oh, okay.
When I went in, yeah.
And where had you been living before you enlisted?
In Hartford,
In Hartford?
Yeah.
Can you describe to me your first couple of days of entering the Navy?
A lot of shots. We enlisted, I went to, I did my boot camp in Sampson, New York. It was a brand new area there, brand new boot camp, and I was in G unit. But actually the first couple of days I actually spent in Hartford. That's where I had all my physicals and everything. Most of my shots were right here in Hartford, Connecticut, yeah. And I left for boot camp. Geez, I don't remember the exact day. But anyway, it was in the evening as well. I caught a train about 10 o'clock at night. And it took us, believe it or not, from Hartford, Connecticut to Sampson, New York. I was on that train for 17 hours.
Wow.
I remember that because we had to give way for all the other trains. We were in no big hurry to get there. In other words, we spent a lot of time on sidings so other trains could get through. I guess they had more important things to do.
Guess so.
Yeah.
What type of environments were you put in?
Well, the Pacific wasn't bad. We hit one storm, a tremendous storm, and that was in the Sea of Japan, just before we got to Japan, because I remember a mail boat was sunk, and we lost a lot of our mail that we were supposed to get,
Mm-hmm.
So, but other than that, wasn't bad at all.
Huh.
The weather was pretty good.
Were you ever surprised by any aspects of entering the Navy?
No. In fact, I was at a movie theater when they announced that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor.
Mm-hmm.
I was at the Lowe's Poli Theater watching a movie. And they stopped the movie to make the announcement that, I was 16 at the time, just 16. And of course, they weren't taking us in till we were 18. They weren't taking any draftees, no draftees or even enlisted personnel.
Mm-hmm.
We had to be 18 years old at the time.
Do you think that you would have gotten drafted if you didn't enlist?
Oh yeah. I knew a woman on the draft board, or my wife knew her pretty well. She was an Italian, and she told me, she says, Frank, she says, you're going to be drafted, probably not this year, but your number will, because I was issued a draft number when I got out of high school. And they told us that we were going to be, I had a pretty high number, and I says, oh, I'm not going to wait around. I says, I'm going to get into what I think is better suited for me, So I enlisted in the Navy. So.
And one of my questions is, please describe your first battle experience, but as you stated earlier.
Well, I really had no battle experiences. The closest thing I got to a battle was seeing, this was after I was on the submarine tender. We were operating out of Guam, the island of Guam. When the Marines took it back, we had sort of, I don't say it was a submarine base, but this is where the USS Shirley was stationed for quite a few years before the war. And it was a converted banana boat, believe it or not, but it was a beautiful ship. It was huge, and they had everything there, to service submarines. Including, they even had periscopes on board, in case some needed a new periscope. But I did most of my service in the Pacific on the USS Shirley, which was a submarine tender.
Oh, wow.
And we were stationed there. I got to Pearl Harbor on board the submarine. But then, when the sub was ordered back to the United States, I was transferred to the Urali. That was in 42. That was, I guess, in late 44. I can't remember now. Let me think a minute. That was late 44. Yeah.
Wow.
You know.
Do you remember anyone being a leader or a role model of yours during these times?
Not really. I had a good friend on the submarine. He had been on quite a few war patrols. Big red-headed guy. He had a huge red beard, I remember that. And he kind of took me under his wing when I got transferred to the submarine. But that was quite a while. See, I went to, after boot camp, they told me I was mechanically minded. They put it. So what they did was my voice is kind of weak. They sent me to submarine school after boot camp. I went to torpedo school in Newport, Rhode Island. And when I graduated submarine school, they asked for volunteers for either the submarine service or the PT boats, motor torpedo boats. And in the meantime, when I was in Newport, a torpedo boat came into the bay there, and they asked us if any of us would like to take a ride on it just to see what it was like. Well, this thing was 60 feet long, and we went out in the bay there, and I'm Narragansett Bay, and I'm telling you, it was a rough day to be out there, because it was in February of 1944. And I went out there and I nearly froze my Tootsie off. And when I got off there, I felt like my stomach was up on the top of my head somewhere. It was a rough ride, but that's what it was, you know. So I took the second choice. I took the submarine service, you know. And when I graduated from torpedo school, I was lucky. I was sent to New London, Connecticut, which was close to home, you know. Now I went all through submarine school, had no problems. I went up in that tank there that they had there, you know, for, that was quite an experience. First they sent me down in what they call a diving bell. It's just it's a big bell-shaped sort of a thing, and it had a platform in it, and what they did was they lowered you from the top of the tank down into this. You were two fellows at a time. We just stand on this bell, and they would lower us into the water. And you know, as the water came up into the bell, the air pressure in the bell increased, so that actually you weren't underwater, you were in water up to about to your waist. And then, of course, you got kind of a little bit of pain in your ears because the pressure would build up.
Right.
It built up to about 45 pounds per square inch.
Wow.
And but it wasn't that bad because you couldn't speak when you were in the bell because the pressure was too high for your voice to even, something would happen to your voice anyway. And you only stayed there for about 30 seconds. And then they lifted the bell up, you know. But they wanted to see if you could take that pressure.
Right.
You know. And then the experiences, some of the school was pretty good. I mean, we went in this pressure tank afterwards, and they increased the pressure to 52 pounds. We went in there as a group, and we just sat on these benches, and it got pretty hot in there after a while, because when you're increased the pressure, the air gets warmer.
Right.
you know. Then we went up into the tank, and how we went into the tank was we went down in an elevator beside the tank, and they gave us each a Momsen lung, which is it's what they had in World War II. It was a sort of an escape mechanism, and it was a mask that you put over your face, and you had like a it was like a rubber. It almost looked like a hot water bottle to me.
Oh wow.
It was attached to the mask, you know. And then what they did was they inflated this tank that was underneath that, strapped to your chest. And you were fed oxygen through this mask into your system. And you had a bite on this mask that you were wearing. It wasn't really a mask, it was just a thing that was over your nose, and of course around your chin. And you had to have a good bite, because you had to bite into this mask, and then they would turn on the air pressure. You turned on the air pressure that came in from the water bottle. I call it a water bottle. It was a little air tank.
Yeah.
Made out of a hard rubber. And then we went down to 50 feet, halfway down the tank. And then the chief was with us. The chief warrant officer was with us. And you wouldn't believe it, some of these guys there could dive from the top of the tank down the full 100 feet without a mask.
Wow.
They were, I'm telling you, I couldn't believe it. They must have had terrific lungs, you know, because they were built, they were all chest, and all muscle, these guys. But anyway, this elevator would start to inflate with water. They would slowly, it came up and up and up till it got about up to your chest. Then they filled the tank, and you started breathing through this Momsen lung, and then they would completely inflate the elevator, this elevator that you were in. You were completely underwater.
Yeah.
And you depended on this tank to breathe through, the mask. Then they opened up the hatchway. There was a hatchway, and they fed this rope down in, a big rope, about a 2-inch rope. And every 10 feet there would be a knot. One by one, we would exit from the elevator into the tank, and every 10 feet we would go up, hanging onto this rope. And when you got up, every 10 feet you got to the 40-foot level, you would stop, take a few breaths, and then go up to the 30-foot level, and 20 and 10, until you were up to the top of the tank.
Wow.
And that was quite an experience. We did that twice. And then, not on the same day though, you know. Just to get used to going, feel what it was like. And then the third time, we went down to the 100-foot level. That was quite an experience to come up. And we did the same thing there twice.
Wow.
And it was just an escape mechanism. But you know what? In a submarine, when you're down over 200 feet, you could kiss your tush goodbye, like they said, because there was no escape. And I figured, if I'm going to go, I didn't want to go. When my dad found out about it, I didn't want to tell my dad what I did, you know. But I was coming home on weekends, almost every weekend when I was going to school there. It was pretty good because I had no trouble getting home or getting back. I didn't have a car, and what I did was just get out there and hitchhike. And if you had a uniform on at that time, you had no trouble getting
Wow.
picked up, you know.
Hmm.
And luckily, I met this young lady, and we got engaged before I went into the service. And I was offered a pretty good job out of high school. I was pretty good in architectural and mechanical drafting. I had like a 4.0 average for the whole 4 years I was in high school. And I was offered a job with a tool and engineering company on Pearl Street in Hartford. But they found out when I was classified 1A. Because right out of high school I was classified. I was 18 at the time, and just waiting to go into the service. And when they found out I was classified, they said, Frank, I'm sorry, but we can't, they said we could probably give you a 6 months deferment, but that wouldn't help us out any, and it wouldn't help you out any either.
Right.
So I had to give up that job, of course. And I just hung around waiting to get drafted. I was going to get drafted, but when they told me I was going to go into service in September, I says, what the heck, there's no sense. I didn't even look for a job, But I had a job while I was in high school. I had the job for quite a while, and I got pretty good at overhauling and repairing typewriters.
Oh wow.
And that's, of course, I had that down in my resume when I went into the Navy. They said, what can you do? I said, well, I'm pretty good at repairing typewriters. So that's where they got the idea that I was mechanically minded,
That's where they got it, right?
But anyway, when I got on the subtender, you wouldn't believe what happened. They asked me, what can you do, And I had this Lieutenant J.G. He read my resume. In fact, he was the only one that read it, I guess. Because when I got on the subtender, they said, we notice here, all the while you were in the service, you were going to school. I said, yeah. I said, just about. I said, the only time I didn't go to school, when I was in New London, after school, I just hung around. There was nothing to do because they didn't have enough submarines for submarine guys. They had so many guys that were waiting, And I met this warrant officer in New London. In fact, I didn't meet him, he met me. He said, can you, anybody here know a little bit about carpentry work? And I said, yeah, I do. I says, I did a little carpentry work. I says, when I was still in grade school, I built myself a nice little jewelry box. And he says, I'll tell you what, he says, you got the time here, because I was just hanging around in New London.
Mm-hmm.
He says, could you build me a sea chest? And I said, sure. I said, just give me the material. So he gave me $50, and he gave me a Jeep. And he says, here, go into New London, he says, go into the lumber yard there, buy what you need, he says, and he says, I want you to build me a nice little sea chest. So I did. I spent the time in New London. I spent the time in the carpenter shop there. I built it, I even lined it with cedar and everything, and I gave him, I bought some nice corner brackets, brass corner brackets, because it didn't take $50 to
Right.
buy the lumber. And he was tickled to death. And he says to me, what can I do for you? I said, for Christ's sake, give me a submarine. I said, I'm sick and tired of hanging around here, you know. And I was going home every weekend, and I said, for Christ's sake, what the hell am I in the service for? I says, I'm, you know, close to home here. I says, I've been close to home now for a year and a half.
Yeah.
I says, I don't want this anymore, you know. So he says, okay, he says, I will. And a week later, I got a submarine. Well, I thought I had a submarine, you know. Sure, I had a submarine. It wasn't even under commission yet. It was still being built down in Philadelphia at the Cramp Shipbuilding Company. But anyway, 2 days later, I was on a train down to Philadelphia. I was one of the first guys to be drafted into the crew. And that's where I met this big redhead kid. He was a first-class machinist mate, you know. He took me out one night. He said, you know, I was kind of a greenhorn as far as, I never drank, you know. I'm sure I'd have a beer once in a while, but he took me out one night. He went to this bar, and when Frank, what do you drink? He says, well, I says, I have an occasional beer. He says, wow, he says, you don't want to drink beer, you know. I says, what are you drinking? He says, well, I drink Boilermakers. So I says, what the heck's a Boilermaker?
Yeah.
He said to me, he says, it's a shot of scotch and a beer chaser. So I said, well, scotch. I says, he says, come on, have one at least, you know. So I had one, and then I had the beer, and it didn't bother me too much. I was a big man, I was 180 pounds. So he says to me, have another, you know. So, well, the next morning I got up and I looked in the mirror, and boy, I looked pretty bad, you know. I needed a shave. So I shaved all right. Instead of taking out toothpaste, shaving cream, I squeezed a whole tube of pan of toothpaste on my face. You know, pan of toothpaste, if you put it on your face, it burns a little bit, and it'll blister your face a little bit.
Oh no.
So I started to take it off, you know. Got kind of warm. I started to take it off, but you know, toothpaste is hard to take off your face once you smear it on there. I had to use real hot water. I finally got it off. But I said, never again, you know. And the next day, Red said to me, Frank, how do you feel? I said, USOB. I said, you really fixed? He says, now you're in the Navy. He says to me.
That's funny. How are your troops organized on your ship?
What's that? Well, we were on the island of Guam, stationed at Guam, and we were in the island there. We were anchored, and we were watching a movie, and all of a sudden this gun went off, 5-inch gun went off, and we all hit the deck, and the skipper came on. He came on board and he said, gentlemen, he says, the war's over. He says, Japan surrendered. And this was, I don't know, the month of August 25th, I think it was. So he says, but he says, contrary to what you think, he says, we are not going home. He says, we've been ordered to go to Japan, to the island of Sasebo, which is the island of Kyushu, he says, and we're going to a little town called Sasebo, or Sasebo. He says, there's a Jap submarine base there. He says, and that's where we're going. He says, and we're going to be involved in the occupation of Japan. So, about 3 days later, we left for Japan. And we got there about a week later. Anyway, when we went into the sub base there, into the harbor, there was a American heavy cruiser in there, and a couple of small destroyers, American destroyers. So, and we weren't let ashore for about the first week because we didn't know how the Japanese, that's why the heavy cruiser went in. We didn't know how the Japanese were going to accept, the surrender. But they did. And it was after about a week, they let us go ashore. And when we went ashore, the Japanese would turn their backs to us. And I don't know, I guess they didn't like us. But we got to them through the children. They loved our chewing gum.
Wow. One of my questions is, were you ever badly injured?
No.
No? Is there someone...
The only injury I sustained when we were in Guam, and we went ashore for a little R&R there. All they did was, we went swimming. And the trouble is, there were a lot of sharks around there. So they had this little inlet there. It was kind of nice, a nice sandy beach. And they strung this big net out there. And that was so the sharks couldn't come in to the bay. But a lot of us we caught a fungus in our ears. And boy, it was terrible. Our ears would itch like the devil, and the wax in our ears would sort of melt from the fungus.
Wow.
And all they did was, they had us lined up for going to sick bay. And I never got over that fungus till I got home. And the only way I got rid of it, it didn't even get down on our record as a fungus. It went down in our record as earrings. And when we got home, I went to the VA and I said, Jesus, how can I get rid of this? And they said, the only way you can get rid of it, he says, we can't treat it. He says, but you'll have to go to a doctor. He says, and he says, we'll pay for it. He says, I had a shot of radiation shot, 2 shots in each ear. And they covered my face with a piece of lead, a little sheet of lead with a little pinhole. And they put it in here, and the radiation went through the pinhole. And they got rid of it.
Wow.
And I had 2 shots in each ear.
Wow.
That was the only injury, really, I sustained. Yeah.
Is there someone specific that you met during your time in the Navy that made anything better or worse for you? Besides the Scotch incident?
No, it certainly made things better, I'll tell you. It taught me how to take orders and how to control my temper a little bit. I was a little short-tempered when I was a kid. But it taught me how to think things out, especially when I got on the sub. The submarine finally went into commission. Let's see, I was in Philadelphia for about 4 months, and that's when they got the whole crew together, and the submarine finally went into commission, and we came back up to New London, and we started our sea trials in New London.
Mm-hmm.
And at one time, we were out in Long Island Sound, and we found out from the Coast Guard later on that there was a German submarine operating 8 miles away from us.
Wow.
And here we were out there training, still diving, still training. You know, people think that because you were in a submarine, you know, you went right out. But there's a lot of training involved. We were trained how to look out at night, pitch black. You could, if you looked out and you could actually see, even if it was pitch black, you could actually see the horizon between the ocean and the sky.
Mm-hmm.
You know, where the ocean met the sky, the line of the ocean, you could actually see that line. And if you looked hard enough, if you looked above the skyline, you could see ships.
That's crazy.
You know, it was quite a thing. We went through a tremendous amount of training. And I was in the after torpedo room. There were only 8 of us back there. But when we took our deep dive, we went down, we had to go outside of the other side of, well, actually in the Atlantic Ocean, the other side of Long Island Sound. We went down, our deepest dive was 450 feet. And you could hear the little creaks in the sub, you know, from the pressure building up the outside, you know.
When you did return home, were you happy, or were you ever?
Oh, I was very happy, yeah, because I was out in the Pacific for less than a year, about, I don't know, 10 or 11 months, that's all. And then we stayed in Japan. I was in Japan Christmas of 45, Thanksgiving and Christmas of 45. And we left Japan, I remember it was February 22nd, George Washington's birthday. We left Sasebo for Pearl Harbor. And it took us, I forget, from Japan to Pearl Harbor was quite a trip. It was about almost 2,000 miles, I guess. It took us about, our ship wasn't that fast either. We traveled at about, our fastest speed was about 18 knots, 18, 19 knots. So we, it took us almost 4 weeks. It took us almost a month. But I was kept pretty busy on the subtender anyway, because they found out that I could repair and overhaul typewriters, and man, I got about 24 typewriters all at once. I was put in a room with a bunch of fellas, about 7 or 8 more guys, and all they did was overhaul mostly instruments, you know, binoculars and stuff like that. And most of them went to school, you know, and I didn't even go to school for any of that stuff. But this lieutenant came in one day with a little Royal Portable in a suitcase. And, oh, it was a mess. And he said to me, "Could you do anything," he says, "with this typewriter?" And I said, I looked at it, and some of the parts were in the bottom of the case. And I says, "My God, where the hell have you been with this thing?" He says, "All over the Pacific." He says, And he says, I need it. He says, because he says, I'm writing, he was writing a sort of a history of where he had been.
Mhm.
And he had a lot of battle stars, this guy. And he was a submarine man. And he was an officer. He was I forget, a navigator or something anyway. But anyway, he had made a lot of war patrols. And he says, I'm writing a story about my experience. He says, I want to write a book. And I says, I'll do the best I can, sir, you know. Anyway, it took me about a week. I spent just on that one machine, you know, one typewriter. But I got it fixed, and boy, he was tickled to death. He was so happy. He says, you know what? At that time, I was a seaman first class. And he said, because it was awful hard to get a rate, especially in the submarine service,
Mhm.
you know. And he says to me, I'm going to make you a third-class petty officer. He says, but you're not going to be a torpedo man. He says, I was rated a specialist artificer instruments, SAI, third class. And he says, now look, he says, you've never been to school for instruments. He says, but I'm going to rate you anyway. He says, because if you could fix this typewriter, he says, you could fix anything. You know? And that's all I did on the, when I was transferred to the submarine tender. I was made part of the crew, of the subtender crew. Actually, I wasn't part of a submarine crew anymore, you know. But at least I got a rating, you know, a third-class rating, which was something,
Yeah.
you know.
Did you have any reoccurring memories of the war when you came home?
Not too many.
Or flashbacks? or anything?
Well, flashbacks. I remember steering the sub. We went from New London up to Newport, not Newport, but up to a little town in New Hampshire. And we picked up some torpedoes there, and we picked up some small arms. Oh, I went to school of the boat up there. It was called School of the Boat. We only stayed there for about a week. Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And oh, it was cold up there, boy. It was cold. And I remember standing watch on the conning tower up there with a pair of binoculars late at night, and the wind was howling, and I was up there for about an hour and a half, and I couldn't even feel my feet anymore, you know. And the only thing that happened was, I remember having the binoculars, and I had to keep my jacket open because they says if we were ready to dive, the first thing you did was take the binoculars, throw them in your jacket, zip your jacket up. That was because at one time a submarine up there was on patrol out in the Atlantic Ocean. They were on patrol duty, but they were still, in other words, it was a patrol they were on, but they were still in school actually. this one kid had his he had his jacket all zipped up all the way, and he had his binoculars outside of his jacket. And when he went to jump down off of the pedestal, he was up there on the conning tower. He got his binoculars caught in the railing. And you know, he drowned.
Oh, wow.
Because he didn't, when everybody else came down, when the order to dive was given, and you heard the klaxon, the first thing you did was zip up your jacket with the binoculars inside. Well, his binoculars got caught in the railing.
Wow.
You know, and he couldn't get loose. And everybody came down, and when the hatch closed, he was still up on the platform. He couldn't even signal to us that he was still up there. Not to us, but to, you know,
right,
to the crew there. It wasn't our sub. But after that, we were ordered to put the binoculars in our jacket, zip it up, quick. So.
If you knew someone that was going into the Navy tomorrow, what advice would you give them?
Well, I would tell them to go into the Navy. I thought it was a terrific branch of the service.
So we were just talking, if someone was going into the Navy, what advice would you give them?
Well, I would tell them to definitely go in, you know, if they had to, you know. But it gives you a, I don't know, it gives you a sense of pride, you know, and it's, I still think a great deal of the Navy, it was a great branch of the service to be in.
That actually ends all of my questions. So in conclusion, thank you very much, Mr. Leva, for everything that you have shared and taught me and Anastasia today. Your experience in the Navy will now be never forgotten, and your experiences will continue to inspire other students like myself. And I'd like to thank you for bringing up all of your flashback experience and memories. It is truly greatly appreciated, and thank you again.
Now, has that thing been going all this time?
Yeah.
I hope you can get my voice in there, because it's, I'm gonna be 86 next birthday.
We got it all, no worries.
You know, when I went in, I thought I could lick the world, you know.
Yeah.
18 years old, and yeah, it was quite a, but it was a part of my life that, you know, I often thought, if I hadn't gone in, if there hadn't been a war, yeah, I'd have probably gone to work for this outfit, you know, and probably be sit at a drafting board for the rest of my life.
Probably, yeah.
You know, until I retired. And I'm probably bored to death half the time, you know. And as it was, I got out of the service in April of '46. I got married the same year in July. I got married in July. I had 2 children. And my wife and I were married 62 years.
Wow.
Which is,
long time.
well, my daughter's been married 30 years. My son was married 19 years and he divorced. So, you know, it's, but I have 3 grandchildren, they all college graduates.
Wow.
My 2 kids are my son wanted to be an automobile mechanic. And I finally talked him into going to college, so he went to school for 3 years, University of Hartford. And he decided he still wanted to be an automobile mechanic. So he went to work for Ford Motor Company. They taught him mechanics. Well, anyway, he did pretty well for himself because now he owns part of a dealership, a Ford dealership.
Oh, wow.
He does pretty well for himself.
Mm.
He went up the ranks pretty good. He started as a front end and power steering mechanic, and then he became a motor mechanic, worked on the engines. Then he became he worked for one couple, for one person, all this, one outfit, one Ford dealership, all this time, yeah. Newman Lincoln Mercury, yeah. He got to be you know, wow. Oh, service manager, yeah. Then when the general manager retired, he got to be general manager.
Wow.
And it's all he's ever done all his life.
That's great, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess the 3 years he went to school for, I told him, I says, Jim, I says, get a degree in business administration. That's a good, you know, and he did. And it stood him in pretty good stead, you know.